I'm just so delighted to be here today with Andrew Luber on the top there. I think that's going to show up on your screen, and Alex Shandelman down below. And these two guys are writing a book together about storytelling. And I'm really eager to learn more from them about what they're working on. But before we get started on that, I wondered if you could each tell me a little bit about your background, maybe what you're doing now, and then how you kind of came through this path through your maybe childhood and education, and what was that little golden thread out in front of you that that drew you to this point of wanting to write this book.
Alex, do you want to go first?
Sure.
So Andrew and I are actually from the same hometown, Lafayette Hill, Pennsylvania, a suburb outside of Philadelphia. And we both came into storytelling, and we're both live out in Los Angeles now, and we're in the film industry, and we're trying to make it as screenwriters, really. So I personally went to Penn State, and I majored in film, and so that's how I came to be obsessed with story, really. But all the way back since I was a kid, I wanted to make videos and stuff like that. But I never took it as seriously as I could have until my writing partner Andrew came in the picture, honestly. And I actually tried to recruit him for a film when we were living in Philly, and it didn't work out. And then we linked up eventually when he moved out to Los Angeles a couple months after I did, and we were just so passionate about trying to make a good quality story and trying to figure out what that meant. So from his background in association with mine, I just thought we made a really complementary team. We kind of just hit it off right off the bat. And what I do during the day, I'm an editor, and I say I'm an editor by day and a writer by night. And we're trying to make it full time as screenwriters out here, which isn't the easiest thing to do. But we thought the best way to do that was kind of really know what a story is and what a good story is and what that means. So that's where we're at right now.
Well, one more question, Alex, before we move on to Andrew. So, what drew you into film in the first place? Why did you want to major in that? I mean, maybe that's every boy's dream. I don't know.
Uh, for me, I kind of feel like I almost like couldn't help it. Like I have like an obsession with, I mean, movies in general, but like specifically music, and I just kind of leaned into editing when I was a kid and always making videos. I would always pressure my friends into it, and I just love the creation aspect of executing an idea. And like when it gets to the storytelling film-based level, when everything is blocked out so explicitly, that's a different level. And I think that in college, like I didn't like accept the challenge, but coming out to Los Angeles, like it's really like in front of your face if you want to make it and really be a part of the industry. And I think that was like a kick in the butt for me to really see what it's all about. And it's only made me more passionate about the craft. And yeah, I'm excited where we're at now, because we're finally at a stage of trying to execute some of our ideas in a more professional and tangible way.
Cool. Thank you. So, Andrew, how about you?
So I liked film growing up. I liked TV, but I didn't actually love it. Like I would say Alex loves it. Um, my passion is in philosophy. And I would say the reason why I love philosophy is probably not to be personal, but trauma. When trauma happens, you kind of respond to that trauma, and you realize that you're in a constant response to this trauma. So you kind of ask, why am I in this constant response to this trauma? And then from there, it kind of takes on a new life, you're thinking. So I majored philosophy at Temple University in Philadelphia. Um, and then I was going to go to law school. And last second, I basically decided, screw it. I'm going to move to California and pursue writing, because in college, I would take philosophies that I learned and turn them into stories. But the thing is, when I first moved to LA, I didn't take art seriously. I thought art was a joke. Like I came from the education where Plato would teach me that artists are bad. They're not good. Like sophistry and all that stuff. So I was trying to implement
the logic in which philosophy is done into story, to ground story in something meaningful. So in my mind, I saw art only being meaningful if it is deeply intimate and related to philosophy. And then in doing so, like I'll give an example of like where like the philosophy really comes into play in storytelling. Like in screenwriting, you can't say Andrew is happy. You have to say things like Andrew smiles, and smiling doesn't necessarily denote happiness. Like you could be smiling and not happy, so smiling only infers happiness. So what one of the questions that came to me was like, how do I create a logic that creates an inference that will tell someone smile equals happiness, even though there's this gap. And I say gap because Michael Levin talks about gaps in the bioelectric the we'll get to it. We'll get to
Yeah,
that. But
the gap junctions. Yeah.
the gap junctions, exactly. So there's a lot of symbolism in the actual phenomenology of doing art with a lot of these scientific, philosophical processes that I was familiar to. So I became obsessed with trying to basically infuse those different schools into story, and then it turned into its own thing where we're writing this book and stuff. But yeah, that I would say that's philosophy, LA, art and philosophy, boom.
Screenwriting.
Screenwriting. And then Alex and I were like, we got hired to write a screenplay by these two producers. So we're trying to, write this book that's not garnering any money while like write screenplays, which is what we're, out here to do. But now we fell in love with this and we'll talk about it, this whole thematic process, thematic structuring, meta structures and whatnot. We just fell in love with this ideology really. And I came across your videos and I'm a huge, huge fan. And I realized, wait, there's people in different domains in the world that are in a sense talking about the same thing that I'm talking about, but just in story. This is blowing my freaking mind. Like, I was like, what the hell is going on? How's no one in the story world? Like, stories have been around forever. They're the oldest thing. How's nobody in the story world talking about this? Like, and we'll go into great detail about what we mean. But yeah, sorry.
I think they're not talking about it, but without even realizing what they're doing, they do it. Right. I mean, in filmmaking, you see this all the time where even in the way the camera pans the landscape, it's telling that same story that is happening in all these other domains through the use of the camera. That is, so let me back up a little bit here. I took some notes on the first part of the book that you sent me. I don't have the whole book, obviously. I only have the first couple of chapters.
We don't either. This is what we felt comfortable sending you, but
yeah, okay.
This is like the beginning, almost like the proof part of stuff. We don't even get into the section that you read.
The stuff that I personally sent you, that gets into the weeds very much so. But like I haven't like Alex can put things in more layman's terms, and what I wrote isn't the easiest to understand per se.
So let me just tell you a couple of things that stood out to me when you were talking about story. You're talking about that there's inspiration, but then beyond that, once the inspiration comes, then you're struck by this myriad of decisions. And the burden of the storyteller is the process of deciding how to get the idea to become a story. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in this little corner of the internet, we know that as combinatorial explosion, but it's something I ran into very early on when I first started painting, even when I was just a raw beginner in painting. If I had a photograph there and I was trying to produce a little watercolor of, let's say, a fountain with some flowers in front of it or something, you're looking at the photograph and all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, there are a million details in this photograph. How do I decide which ones are important? How do I decide which ones will convey what I see when I look at this photograph? Why is this photograph enticing to me? And I think it's exactly the same problem that you're facing with story. And that's just one of the first things that I noticed. But as you go on, you're breaking down the difference between story hyphen telling and storytelling, all as one word, which I find quite fascinating, but I can't quite grasp what it is you're getting at there. And then you go also into the difference between thema and theme. That one I grasp a little bit more clearly. So I want to talk about both those things, but could you start by telling me what you mean by the difference between storytelling and storytelling?
So I'm sure Alex will have his own explanation to this. So I'll just give my little spiel, and then Alex, you can just jump in and whatnot. But basically, storytelling without the hyphen doesn't take into account the a priori nature of the story. It doesn't take into account the actual ontology of story. So it's basically when Wolfgang Smith talks about the Cartesian bifurcation, like this is storyteller without the hyphen is the epitome of that. It is the story. I create the story because these are things that I like, and I make sense of the things I like. It's a self-autonomous thinking. It's an AA type of thinking, and therefore I just put out entertainment where it's void of the ontology, the meaning of, and that's where story is dwelling in. So it's basically just putting out things that are flat, dopamine, attention grabbing content where it doesn't create a self-referencing feedback loop.
Would this be like so much of what's passing for story nowadays as that's just propagandistic?
Yes, that would be an example of, I would call that theme poured top down, where it's just like it's not emerging, it's not arising naturally in the story because the story comes from the theme. So the theme is a priori in a sense to story. But there's also like, go ahead, Alex. You want?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what you said, Karen, because I think like from a tangible place, like as we're here as consumers watching stories on TV, like you said, like I don't want to be like presumptuous, but the content that's being put out today isn't quite at the same level from a meaning standpoint that it used to be, it seems like. And like people might disagree with that, but I think because there's so much content that people are thinking in almost like a backwards way, in like, I just want to get your attention. I just want to entertain you. And like, I'm just going to point to our definition that we point out in Story, what Google says, in that story should be told for entertainment. And what we talk about at the beginning of the book is that the standard of entertainment is not only subjective, but it's impossible to agree on. And we understand that storytelling is subjective no matter what. So what our book is trying to do is find the ground for what multiple subjects can stand on and agree on from an objective place. So when you're talking about writing a good story, there's qualifiers that come along with that, and entertainment is an elusive one. So like when you're talking about panning a camera, that's telling a story, yes, in a certain way, but without a beginning and end, it's tough to understand like what a certain shot would mean, for example. And I think that, and it makes sense, Hollywood has gotten caught up in prioritizing these new technologies, CGI, different camera techniques, as opposed to, which is funny, prioritizing really what the root of their content is, which is the story. And I think have lost sight of really what a story truly is. And that's what we're here to kind of bring back to the surface of what we're doing in movies and TV.
Yeah, and I don't want to go into a tangent, but this relates also to the current AI models, where AI models operate under a modeling system where it's self-autonomous and that you just need to update the model. There's not this like AB model that is conjoined with the AA model that allows for this AA model to self-reference itself, self-reference to this AB model. in order to improvise, to take a risk and make a decision. So like in my mind, I'm thinking of like the self-driving car. Self-driving cars will just stop. They're not the best at improvising. If there was an awareness of this, and we'll talk about it in terms of story, this thematic structuring, it will be able to have this self-relation where it can then improvise is the theory. But I don't want to go off on a tangent. Let's stick with story. But
Basically going to be analogizing theme with like how AA models are structured in relation
with
to
life,
and
like
life.
you can do it with government systems and relationships, and like to me it's, and we could talk about it, and there's a channel ran by Daniel Garner and Michelle Garner called OG Rose, where I'm friends with them. I premiere on the show. We have a series talking about it, substantive democracy, non-rational societies, non-rational relationships, where we can get into that. I don't mean to go off on a tangent with the story stuff.
Yeah, well, so let's bring it back into synchronous with reading your stuff. I was also watching a Jordan B. Peterson episode. I don't even remember who he was talking to. I watched so much of that stuff, but he says that a story describes the structure of meaning through which we see the world. So the story describes the structure of meaning through which we see the world. And when I heard that, the way I translated it was into my own artistic worldview that I have. And that is that the structure of meaning through which I see the world is what I've struggled to find a word to use. I've just struggled to find a label to put on that. Sometimes I call it my experiential DNA. That was the word I came up with like 20 years ago to describe it to myself, in that I'm a unique individual, not only because of my physical DNA, but also because of my experience, every way in which I've interacted with the world, whether it's things that I've done or people that I've met or conversations I've had or songs that I've heard, the context in which I heard that song, teaching that I've heard, videos that I've watched. All those things have built in me what I guess I would call a schema, kind of a fuzzy attractor in me, so that anytime new information comes in or new sensations come in, they attach in some place or other to that schema that is me. And so then I'm filtering all that coming into me so that I understand it in a unique way from the way that you understand it. If I watch that camera panning over that landscape, I'm going to see entirely different things than you are. But so then when I try to communicate that out to somebody, I'm also, all that communication from me is going through that filter. So by the time it comes back out of me, it is my own unique perspective of how I see it, struggling with my own unique incapacities for communication. And then it meets your filter and goes through your filter. So that is, I think we each have a structure of meaning through which we see the world. But then there also is a structure of meaning, which is the world. So all of us are struggling with how does our story get to line up with the story? And this is I kind of talk about that as being aligning with reality, because I have a certain perspective of what reality actually is. But anywhere, work of art is very similar to that in what Jordan Peterson says. When you're creating a work of art, you're struggling to present this structure of meaning that's inside of you to another person who also has a structure of meaning. Where are the connections going to be made in that communication? And they're probably going to see things in that work of art that I didn't even intend, because they've had their own set of experiences.
Talk about this stuff all the time. Andrew, I think you should, with Karen saying, talk about Dasein.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Karen, if you've not read Heidegger, I'm a Heideggerian.
I have not read Heidegger, but I have listened to Jordan Peterson's episode about Heidegger and Dasein. And yes, Dasein is very close to what I'm talking about, but not quite. also relevance realization is very close, but not quite. I think what I'm talking about is something that maybe both of those things are inside of what I'm talking about.
Absolutely. So Alex, relevance realization is a John Vervaeke term, correct? Where he talks about salience landscape and how you realize like relevance realization. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory what the statement is.
Well,
but
how do you pick out of any set of combinatorial explosive facts or
yeah,
of the world, how do you pick out of that the thing that is relevant to you in that moment for that purpose? This is something that AI has a very difficult time doing, because one of the examples John gives is if you have a robot and the robot is pulling a wagon and there's a bomb on the wagon, and you tell the robot you want him to get that wagon from point A to point B, and he starts pulling the wagon and the bomb explodes. So then you think, well, I have to give the robot more information. So maybe you say, give him some instruction about how to be concerned about the bomb, but then the robot's mind, not mind, but the robot goes off into, there are a million different things associated with that, and by the time it comes to a decision, the bomb has exploded again, because it can't discern what are the relevant points of that thing.
So
and but human beings are super good at this.
yeah. So Alex and I would say the bomb being on the ride would be bad bounce. So the computer basically would recognize that it would be bad bounce and therefore get rid of the bomb in a way that doesn't impede what's the distance in their telos. So I kind of used
but I mean, obviously in that situation, how it gets rid of it and who else is going to be affected by it is something that becomes combinatorial explosive again. So the robot can't make decisions about. That's why autonomous driving has been having such a problem, because there's so many things to take into account when you're deciding whether to hit this thing or that thing.
Yeah, I would say what the robot does with the bomb, like, that's also very context dependent, you know. Is there other robots that have the same capabilities around that it can, you know, give it to a robot where its purpose is to disintegrate such material? So
I think relevance realization also ties up with what you talk about, Andrew, in your writing about when you're looking at good, what is good? You have to think about, this might verge on utilitarianism, but good for what purpose, right?
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, we talk about the contextual threshold, basically being the qualifier. But Andrew, based on what Karen's saying, I want you to talk about how theme creates a ground for communication.
Yeah. So basically what you described, where everybody has their own story, physically, experientially, and it's their own. That is basically what Heidegger is trying to do, where Dasein is the ground of grounds. It grounds finitude. So basically, he's trying to figure out what is the proper context in which we can make opinions, ways of being, essentially. And he doesn't. So I had this professor, David Woolstorff, who talks about goodness, and he talks about Plato's question, what is goodness? And his answer, and this is, I might as well promote his book. This is his book right here on goodness. It came out fairly recently, I think like 2018 or 19. And basically, Heidegger talks about finitude in a way that encompasses what finitude is, which is just a mere possibility. So he talks about existence as possibility. Theme is basically everything that's in existence. So Dasein is existence itself, and everything that is that which creates the experience, that which has the beginning and end. So when you talk about John Vervaeke and how he talks about salience landscape, like there's aspects in the landscape that aren't salient. For Heidegger, he would call that unthematic objects, where in a certain sense, they're not in the actual finitude, they're not in the experience. It's not what is actually conforming. These are the implicit things that kind of afford the explicit things to reveal itself to you. So Heidegger kind of takes all of that into account. In fact, I honestly think, because Heidegger talks about relevance, very similar to how John Vervaeke talks about relevance. So I see like how John got his inspiration from Heidegger. But theme and how we understand it is essentially taking into account the implicit and explicit content. And the explicit content, however, is just what is identifiable within the story. So the implicit content is other like we would consider it as other possibilities that aren't realized yet. So when you make a decision, you have a necessity spectrum, and that necessity spectrum comes from a few places. The necessity spectrum comes from your thema, which is to take into account Heidegger's thrownness, that we're being in the world, we're thrown into reality. So like I was born Jewish, like my parents were Jewish, like that is, I couldn't control, that is the environment in which I arose from. So there's that element of the historicity element. And then, so that goes into what's necessary for you to see possible. And that's basically what the necessity spectrum is the necessary things in which you are able to see the possibility and able to implement a possibility. It's not just seeing it, like these are only possibilities that are possibly implementable. So it's not just like random, oh, like in this story, instead of it, the mom dying, just being crude here, a duck flies, like something super random that's not even possible. Like it's not just any possibility. There's how you talk about it. There's these constraints that allow you to choose out from the constraints. So it's not, you have free will within a deterministic framework. And I have your last video in mind, honestly, where the guy's like super hard free will, where in my mind, he's just not seeing that like it's compatibilism. It's determinism affords the ability, you're determinately free. Like that is the paradox in my mind. So it's not just simply free will, to kind of push back on your past guest. But
well, did you happen to see the comment that Architect posted on the past video about free will determinism? It's very good.
I didn't really.
Yeah.
I gotta read it.
He posted one comment, and then I asked him to clarify one part of it, and then his second response to me, both of them are very, very good. But he talks about this thing about how determinism and free will work together, and he explained it in a very clear way. So yeah,
absolutely. So basically,
I mean, I think about that a lot just because of the whole. I'm very reluctant to completely give up on the idea of causality. just because philosophers say that they're well, who was it? Kant, I guess, who said that you can't really know
the thing in itself.
Yes, well, and partly you can't really see causality because we only have our physical sensations to go by, which kind of bypasses the whole idea that you could have ideas that are outside of your physical experience. So I'm very reluctant to completely give up on the idea of causality. Let's just put it that way. And so if getting rid of causality forces you into that free will is the only choice and determinism doesn't have any part in it, then I think there's a flaw in the reasoning there somewhere. But but to be fair to my guest, we only delved into a tiny bit of his book. So I don't think that he's completely free will all the way. I think he does have an understanding that determinism does play a role.
Yeah, I mean, the way he was talking about it, my reaction is like, it seems like you're determined to be free with the way you're talking about it. So I don't know what you're saying, my guy. But back.
Well, to be fair, he's a lawyer and not a philosopher.
That's true. That's true. That's true. So, this necessity spectrum, this necessity spectrum is grounded in theme, and what that means is you have this, like I said, this thrownness. You have these what we call thema, this meta structure in which you see your life in. It's, you know, a Christian meta structure, a marriage meta structure. It's how you, it's a definitive beginning and end that affords your livelihood, your life. So if it's any type of beginning and end that gives not credence, but allows you to have a life within that beginning and end, that would be considered a meta structure to us. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but
so like we're analogizing Heidegger's conception of Dasein with Story's conception of theme. So like, just to make the bridge about like where like the definitive ground lies, like we analogize, and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, thema, which structures theme basically, which Heidegger would reference as the big B, and these are things that are already done basically in the world. They're already finite. So like a concept of like love, for example, like these things are like, love wouldn't even necessarily, it wouldn't even apply. It would need to be like to have another side to love, like Christianity, for example, that like has like a set of rules, and it's already in the world in some capacity and has a beginning and end, where Dasein is the why behind the small b, which encapsulates being in the world, and in that sense, an experience. He tries to do away with the subject object discrepancy, and says that they're infused in each other, and that Dasein is the meaning behind any given experience. And the reason that he's able to say that is because any being, small b, is eventually going to have an ending and therefore become a big B. And so we analogize this to story and theme, where the experience is the story and the theme is Dasein, that's based on a pre-existing meta structure that he would refer to as a big B, that structures the theme.
And he's not exactly sure what being with a capital B is. He can tell you what it's not very well, and it's very, when he tells you what it's not, you're left with, well, what the hell is it? Like, you're just not sure. And
yeah, I don't want to be presumptuous. I'm not nearly as bad on Heidegger. Andrew, I'll just get this information from Andrew, but if I was using loose terms, but that's the analogy there.
Yeah. So basically,
well, let me clarify a little bit here to see if I'm following you. When you talk about the meta structure, is this consonant with when Jordan Peterson talks about the big story that all stories represent? That he talks about, for example, the hierarchical nature of the world, and the good father, the benevolent father, and the tyrannical father, the benevolent mother, the tyrannical mother, that these are all part of this meta story that is all other stories kind of are embedded in that.
Yes,
so and no. Talk about meta structure, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, it can apply to that, but also can apply to particulars like marriage. You can have a Christian marriage, a Arab marriage, a Buddhist marriage. There's all these different conceptions of marriage. So within that Jordan Peterson's grand story type of situation, he's not taking into account that these grand stories also are infused in terms that in their own right are grand, and that like these grand stories have different conceptions of these other quote unquote grand stories. I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding Mr. Peterson, but I just think he's only talking about like the backdrop, so to speak, and not necessarily.
Let me hone in a little bit on this idea of marriage, because that's one of my favorite things to think about, is that in some way or another, to me, everything collapses down into a basic something, which I've been trying to hone in on for a long time. Limitations, boundaries, constraints, that's all part of this basic thing. But I also think marriage thematically is part of the very foundation, because, and we see it played out in multiple ways, like in opponent processing, in unity of multiplicity. You see it in various ways that marriage is kind of at the hub. But when I talk about marriage that way, it is not whether it's Christian marriage or Arab marriage or Indian marriage, it's marriage itself. The very foundational idea of marriage, of two people uniting. You can look at it at the very cell level.
Mhm.
You can look at it at the cell level of two things coming together, but then also of what comes out of that. So you have all of this possibility funneling into this very constricted place, which is marriage, because there are a lot of limitations when you're married. And then out of that proceeds all this creativity. So at that hub point is a marriage of some kind. Jonathan Pajot talks about the marriage between heaven and earth as being one of the foundational things. But I think the concept of marriage in its most fundamental, I think, is very basic to the world. So I guess when I'm thinking metastructure, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. What is it that ties the world together? What does the world consist of?
Religio, the bonding ground.
Well, that gets tied up with all these already thoughts that people have about religion, which I think I think we should avoid words like that. So
Right.
I'm more interested in thinking about principles. I think what physics misses is physics is always looking at rules, but I think they should be looking at principles. And I think biology is a little better at looking at principles. But I think there's a set of principles that tie the world together. And those principles are the same principles that you use in writing story. They're the same principles that an artist uses in creating art. And I think they're the same principles that were used at the creation of the universe. So, yeah, to me, that's the metastructure would be. And the thing about principles is that it's not rules, right? There are constraints to those principles, but it's a very flexible way of organizing things, because let me just give you one example. In art, there are, roughly speaking, 7 elements and 8 principles, but you can parse it a lot of different ways. But the elements are what shows up in the painting. This probably also shows up in writing: line, size, shape, direction, color, value, and texture. You can think of those words in a variety of ways, but those are the elements. Those are the parts of the work of art. When you look at, let's say you're looking at a painting on a canvas, those parts will show up in almost every painting you've ever looked at, even if it's a black and white something or other. All that stuff is in there. But any one of those parts, like line, can be affected by all of these principles, which are unity, harmony, contrast, dominance, repetition, variation, gradation, and balance. And each one of those principles can be exhibited at more or less on a spectrum. So by the time you set up a matrix of elements and principles, and then look at all the possible combinations, and then add in all the possible colors that could be used, and all the possible gradations between each of these things, you now have a combinatorial, explosive set of decisions that has to be made. But any one of these principles can interact with the other principles. They can also interact with the elements. So you can have a line that is graded from pale to dark. And at the same time, that line is graded from thin to thick. And at the same time, that line can be gradated from being a very straight, firm line like a Sharpie to a very textural line like you would have with dry brush of paint. So every single thing works together at some level or another on this kind of sliding scale, but it makes a very flexible possibility for creation so that there's a lot of room for movement, but at the same time, those principles ground the creation so that at the end there is unity and there is harmony. And those things are what draw the viewer into the story.
So, Alex, do you have anything to say before I jump?
I just want to clarify a couple things. So we're talking about like it's like it's a broad topic, and so I think when you mentioned like the meta structure like of the world basically, and how everything kind of comes from this like big religio, I think that's harder to put a finger on. And obviously, like that's like the big question, kind of like where's everything coming from, of course. So from our
experience, from an experience Infinitude standpoint. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but so like I do want to like steer for now, like steer clear. Andrew is actually working with our mutual acquaintance Daniel about more of like the story of meaning as a whole, which is like a project in its own. But I just want to put our focus into basically just like our concept of the way that we're thinking about. And so you're talking about art, and we talk about painting and aesthetics in general a lot, talk about music. And I do want to say also that like on the other side of the spectrum a little bit, art, painting specifically, is harder to articulate the mentality that we're talking about than it would be talking about with actual story, because you're able to specify things with like legitimate, like obviously painting itself, but like referential language, like words on a page, for example. So like I think that it's important for us to just describe like the analogy more specifically with story before talking about how it relates to other aesthetics, just so we're on the same page, I guess. But like basically what you were talking about, I did want to make like a specific note just so you know where we're coming from. Like you're talking about like the biology of things and how that does a better job than physics. What basically we're thinking about with story is that theme and thema combined more or less are the physics behind an experience, and the experience itself or the story is the biology itself. And you're talking about the possibility, and I would say that from what you're saying with all the techniques that you're talking about, the gradients and the lines and such, those are just executions of the possibility, but the possibility itself and where it comes from is really what the ground is that makes it understandable, not necessarily the actual brushstrokes themselves. And
sure, absolutely. Because the possibility would be like, let's say the possibility, and I might not be using your terminology, but it's the idea. And then that idea has to go through that filter of what I would call schema or experiential DNA, that as that idea goes through that filter, then that idea becomes realized in paint or in words or in whatever medium that you're using, right? So the idea is, so like the idea the ground, or is whatever that idea came from originally is the ground?
So like when you think of an idea without you knowing it or not, it kind of has these like thematic elements that are automatically attached to it. You just can't like encompass everything in your mind all in one fell swoop when you first think of an idea. Like let's say you wanted to write a story about marriage, like we talked about, and we actually the first story that we wrote that we really started to use theme properly is about marriage. And you start thinking about like the immediate things that come along with marriage and what that means. And so like we have these two characters named eyes and ears, and basically one can see and not hear, and the other can hear and not see. And the relationship is based off like their counterparts. And
they rely on each other's functions and the lack thereof.
So like immediately you start to see these thematic elements. And what we mean by thematic elements is like, what does that really mean? What could that story mean? And it could be a comedy, it could be a happy ending, it could be a tragedy too, but those are going to mean different things. And it depends where the character starts at. And it's similar to a painting where it's like you could get the idea, like think about it, like if you were going to change one tiny little brushstroke, it's a different possibility of your painting, but is it going to change like the real core of it? Maybe not. Maybe it would, but you know, one brushstroke, probably not. And like that's like a line of dialogue. It's not going to necessarily change the whole meaning of the story. But then you start thinking about like, I still want to keep the overall, like what somebody's going to take from this, the meaning. And obviously you're saying everybody's going to take something different, but what a theme does is it encompasses this ground that everybody's necessity spectrum can access. So like when you're talking about like a story about marriage, for example, and Andrew,
let me clarify. Any experience that has a beginning and end can access. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, which we relate directly to story because there's a beginning and end. So it's like you can assign as the creator what metastructure you're basing this off of. So we were thinking, okay, like we're kind of basing it off of the classical marriage where like there's equal, but we didn't touch on every single aspect of marriage in our story. You know, like we touched on
the viewer can fill in those blanks. Like you, exactly. The viewer will relate to that because we are touching on something that triggers the phenomena of marriage to be revealed internally to your internal dialogue. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the same way good painting should work. You have to leave spaces for the viewer to have their own experience.
Like you're saying that good painting, it's like, what does that really mean? And so what we're using as the qualifier, basically like, you know, I think you read the first 14 pages where we're talking about a qualifier like height when it comes to being a good basketball player. Like it has to have context and you have to be able to find that. Well, we're talking about a story having a beginning and end. And like, just like somebody's body begins and ends, like so does a story. So you can look at the story and be like, wait, does that make a good experience in relation to a theme, which is based off of metastructure, which is like marriage. So if a theme executes like our story, The Orange, I think does, it's like, oh, if you do this in a marriage that's unequal, you're going to have a tragic ending. And because it's based off of something real, like we were talking about, like, what if somebody who's a Christian, a really devout Christian, watches The Orange, that's what our story is called, sorry. And what happens if a misogynist does? Well, if they understand that there's like this tragic ending for this relationship that seems equal at the beginning, the misogynist is going to be like, life's not fair. You know, like that guy did what he thought he did what he wanted to do, and he had a reason to basically do, because he pulled his weight, basically, is what happens in the story. But a Christian would be like, oh, that damn, his name's Eyes, that damn Eyes, he so dumb. He had such a good thing with ears. And the point is that two people that are thinking about things completely differently, that just have the basis of being able to understand. And that's what I want Andrew to talk about this a little bit more, because I think this was what you're touching on with the bomb example, that like what I think a lot of people try to think about is like, what is the audience going to think? And I think that's like almost a silly question. Yes, people understand things differently, but the basis of understanding, it's not like, if you're able to comprehend like, okay, this guy walks over to the fridge, then you should be able to like understand what marriage is. Okay, this guy walks over to the fridge but doesn't get something for his wife, and she asked him to, you know, like it's not that far off. And Andrew, maybe you want to touch on like where we decide.
What is theme? That's what we need to talk about. Like, and I apologize for like not being able to just like explicitly like just say what it is. But basically, like, right, Alex, what you're asking, like, what is theme at this point? Like, what theme is basic? So the foundation.
Let me give you something that stuck out to me when I was reading the difference between thema and theme, is that thema is what exists prior to the action, which I'm assuming is whatever meaning is prior to action. And then theme is whatever arises out of the action.
It's so Theme is yes, it's that, but it's also in a sense heart. It's like the in between space between. So to use Wolfgang's icon, so the icon, if you will, is Thema. You have that center line, which is like the theme, and then that dot on the edge is the story.
With the perception.
So the perception, the right. So like theme basically is a and we'll talk about we come up with a semantic like I didn't even realize Wolfgang talks about metaphysics of semantics. Like I didn't read that. I thought I had this idea of metaphysics of semantics, and basically having a language, a poetic language that is metaphoric. The story structure, there's a language that provides that experience to communicate with that which is beyond. So having an openness in the language where it's metaphoric, where you have to use a language of precision to fill in the gap of what the metaphoric language triggers you to have. So like we have, so let me backtrack for a second. Theme is a full, we call it, it's a command. It's an esoteric command, if you will. And it has a subject and a predicate. And the most foundational theme is don't let your ego change your ethics, or don't let your ethics change your ego. So what we mean by ego and ethics is basically they are the ontological terms that trace back to the thema in which the theme is already dwelling in. And it's also the a posteriori way of gaining access to that ontological space. So it's
Let me translate really quick. For in an analogy to a story, if this meta structure that we were basing our story and theme off of was marriage, then the ego would be based on what the protagonist who vehicles the given theme and interprets the command. The ego is the difference between what the main character, the protagonist, and the ethics, which represents the meta structure, how they differ. The ego represents what the character doesn't agree on in relation to the meta structure. So in our story, it would be like the protagonist agrees on everything that the world of marriage stands for, except for what basically happens in the story, and it ends up like transferring into you showing what the character doesn't agree about marriage for. And then what we're saying is, because the character doesn't agree about marriage in this way, it's a tragic ending. And it could be the opposite, and it could be the character is thinking too much about himself at the beginning, and then decides to act accordingly with marriage, and then it's a happy ending, or vice versa. Maybe that's a tragic ending. But you can see that before.
So it's the one place that you miss the mark.
Well, I would say the ego
is the
is
one place that doesn't fit. It's the one
in your individual landscape. So like if the ego is what the individual thinks is good, and while ethics is what the general, what the world, the collective, what's good for allowing the conformity, the collective, the subject and object to afford each other, what's good for that affordance versus what's good for just the subject.
So what's good for these two characters to have a good marriage, that's based off of marriage. But the main character has a different perception of that. It's just at the beginning, he's not acting on that difference.
And it's also based off of the world itself. Like without them together, there wouldn't be a world. There wouldn't be this story. So the stakes of which is the actual existence. So typically, the ethics can tackles the conception in which the world is allowed to be the world. So there's other stories where it's not like the world ends necessarily, but how the protagonist sees the world from the beginning has now changed, because he's now seeing the world in terms of a different way of affordance, essentially.
So are either of you guys married?
No, he has a girlfriend. but no.
Okay, so this is one of the little known secrets about marriage. I mean, everybody who's married knows it, but that's exactly why I relate marriage to opponent processing, because you come into marriage with this ethical idea of what marriage is. You know, whatever surrounding you've been in, you have some picture of what marriage is. Maybe you get it from movies, maybe you get it from your family, maybe you get it from good examples you've seen or bad examples you've seen, whatever. You come into marriage with that picture. But then when you actually get married, you're faced with magnitudes of your own selfishness. And you come into absolute confrontation with how your selfishness butts up against their selfishness. One teacher that I heard one time talks about it as the Sandpaper Principle. It seems to work out that in every marriage, you're united in the way that the thing that rubs me the wrong way is the thing that you do, and the thing that rubs you the wrong way is the thing that I do. Whatever my issue is rubbing off your rough spots, and whatever your issue is rubbing off my rough spots. And if you don't realize that, if you resent the fact that your rough spots are getting rubbed off, it's going to end in disaster, because your ego is getting in the way of whatever. Maybe it's not, when I use the word ethics, I'm probably using it the wrong way from what you're talking about, but whatever true marriage is, your ego can get in the way of that, because you're not recognizing that there's a purpose in the other person exposing your selfishness and exposing your issues. Yeah. There's a purpose in all of that for each person to grow and to grow out of that, and then to support one another in going through this process of basically sandpaper hurts. It hurts a lot.
I do want to clarify just that the word ethics and ego can be a little bit misleading. When we're talking about ethics and ego from like these
thematic perspectives,
like they're like existential words. So when ego, we're not necessarily saying ego is bad or good at all. We're just referencing that that's the perspective of a given protagonist, and in relation to like a different experience, like a experience of life. That talking about AI, you could define what the protagonist is, where ethics isn't necessarily good either. It's just the representation of the world, and these things. The distinction is that these things are infused in one another. And I just want to clarify a few things, because I don't want to come off as pompous, because there are lots of good stories that have translated like throughout our existence. Romeo and Juliet stood the test of time. Shakespeare, great movies. The Godfather, stuff like that. There are plenty of good movies that have been made that have what we would call a good theme, more or less
being executed.
Yeah. The distinction that we're trying to make and what we're trying to change about, first, like obviously in the industry, like that's a tall task in itself, is that it's not being done. The execution of a good story is not being done with intention.
It's part of the backing. Real quick. I'm sorry, go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that like again, just to bring up our earlier point, that like currently stories are trying to get people's attention, and they're kind of backing into the thematic realm, what the meaning is, where when we write stories, we're constantly oscillating between what's entertaining and how does that relate to the theme that we're basing the story under as it is. So I always like to use this example, which I think is honestly like ridiculous, and hearing our friends that work in TV, they talk about how these legendary producers and showrunners, when they're writing the first season of a television show, they're not thinking about the end of the story. And to us, that is
Lost.
Yeah. Oh, you're talking about Lost, the show specifically?
Yeah.
Right. Like this amazing first season. That's great. Like Game of Thrones. Unbelievable books, unbelievable, but like the guy didn't finish the story, and look what happened. People are already starting to forget about this amazing, and it was like the best TV ever. And I just want to use the apartment analogy, Andrew. Mm-hmm. We always like why in this industry, in TV and film, where you're trying to make a profit and you're trying to have a quality product, Why is it the only industry where like completely subjective, and what I mean by subjective is just like what the artist wants is just so like accepted as like the standard. It's just so crazy. Like think about if an architect was building a condominium and the person who's financing the condo is like, okay, I want to build the first floor of a condo. I want to have the possibility of us expanding it into as many floors as I want, just like the first season of a TV show. But we just don't have the money or the backing to do so yet. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna make an amazing first floor. It's gonna be amazing.
Best lobby ever.
I'm not gonna think about the expansion at all. Well, like when you get to the point where it's a successful first floor of a condominium, and you get to the point it's like, oh wow, I could make a second floor. You gotta break down so many walls and change the entire structure if you're just thinking about trying to make a great first floor. And we think about it the same way. If you're just trying to make a good first season of a television series, that's going to cause a lot of issues when you go and try to make the entire show as a whole. And
let me just jump in. The reason why that's the case is language. They don't have the language that gives them the ability to see, for them to do that. Like when they hear the budget, the language that people operate under only makes them see their objective very myopically. That's part of the problem. Sorry, I just wanted to jump in.
I also want to add something there, and because when you were talking about that, the picture that jumped into my mind immediately, my husband is a marketing guy in a tech company. And he's always talking about how one of the big problems in tech is if you let the engineers drive the company, they'll make whatever they think is cool. They'll get some idea and they'll spend a lot of time making this thing that they think is really cool, but it turns out nobody really wants that thing. So you have this thing that everybody thinks is super cool that costs a lot of money to build, but they can't sell it because nobody wants it. Where when you think about, say, Lost as an example, they had this really cool first season with all these paranormal effects and all that kind of stuff, and you think it's going to be heading someplace, and you kind of keep that in mind through every subsequent season, and you think, wow, there's something really deep going on here, really profound, and then you hit that last episode and it's like, oh my gosh, what a waste of time. I wasted 7 years worth of TV viewing on this thing because the last episode sort of rewrites everything else that you saw. You thought you were seeing some particular thing, but then you find out, no, it's just they ran out of stuff. They couldn't figure out how to end it. So they just poof, you're all dead. You've all been dead all this time. Well,
this is exactly how it relates to Heidegger's conception of Dasein. It's like your existence only means something when it's over. You could be a great person your whole life, and then your last day on earth, you kill somebody, and your entire existence is defined by a complete different set of morality. Same thing with the story. If the last episode doesn't make sense for the rest of the story and doesn't bring it home, you're going to be left with that same feeling. It's like, what the hell was the first part of the story then?
Right. Heidegger says,
which is why, and nobody cares, but I can't go back and rewatch Lost.
Why would you?
I can go back.
Right.
Like Chuck, I think Chuck is one of the most beautiful narrative arcs of all TV that's ever been made. I know that's probably stupid because Chuck is just a stupid meaning, but I love Chuck. I can rewatch it endlessly because every episode has a perfect narrative arc.
You say
all the characters have perfect narrative arcs, and the whole series has a perfect narrative arc. Right? And I can rewatch it.
In that sense. If it has a good narrative arc, there's a reason that you're coming back to it.
Yeah, yeah.
Those middle episodes mean something, and you want to watch them again.
Yeah.
There's that return element. There's always that return element. Heidegger says you're born as many men and you die as a single one, and we embody that in a story. And how you talk about painting, every paint stroke basically is one. It delimits the next in a certain sense. So just I think personally you would love Heidegger. Like I think he made me realize that our language is limiting us and our ability, because we're in the story realm and we're not able to intentionally think about what we would call the thematic dimension because of the language that we use. So like we have terms like balance and distance, for example, so Heidegger talks about time in a very funny way. For him, it's static. So it's not necessarily linear. So like story, however, story domain, the story dimension, that's a linear temporally. There's a beginning, middle, and end. But from the thematic dimension, it's not a linear at all. It's static. The moment. Each moment encapsulates what this is Heidegger terms. What was, what currently is present at hand, and what is to come. And what is to come means nothing can come. Something is coming, and it might be nothing. And basically, all of these things, these different what was and what's to come, is all encapsulated in every single moment. So we have these terms that basically capture that temporal movement. And what these terms aren't exact. So like bounce, the definition of bounce is the anticipation of what's to come. So the anticipation of what's to come entails what was and what currently is. So in a certain sense, bounce, you provide content that makes you understand what happened, what currently is, and what you think is going to happen. And that's the whole point. You're like thinking this is what's going to happen, where we have this other term called distance, where basically it just means you are distancing the true possibility. So whatever you think it might happen might not actually happen, because distance, what's being distanced, is not allowing you to see that true possibility. So it always becomes a surprise. And when you are surprised, what happens to your mind and what you think, it starts improvising, and it starts making sense of itself in a new way. And that type of thinking movement, like I can't help but just to think of like, you know, Xenobots and just like AI, in terms of like it having a coding that replicates the language that Alex and I came up with, this like metaphoric language, in order for the story dimension code to understand how to update itself, if you will, improvise itself. No,
I just want to give a couple examples, like in story terms, like if you're going to talk about the distance of, like, you could talk about, like, it's kind of almost improper to talk about the distance of like a specific sequence, because they're still yet to come. But you could say, okay, like at the end of Lost season 1, they open the hatch, and that's like the true possibility of what ends up happening. But the bounce is kind of also it's the anticipation, but you can also talk about it in terms of understanding in real time in relation to the distance. So we're always kind of relating back and forth because they're subsumed in one another. Like the bounce that's happening in real time, it has a distance in mind, or else it wouldn't be like part of the understanding of what eventually happens. So like obviously story is a very controlled environment, but like in life, like you got to think about this stuff too. Like you want to hit up somebody for a favor, but you don't want somebody to just think that you're just hitting them up for a favor. So what you're thinking about is like that end possibility that's going to happen. So what you do is you hit them up first. Oh, let's go hang out. Let's have breakfast. So there's bounce toward there being some communication in the relationship for what you eventually want. And obviously that's like a little maniacal, but like it could be done in lots of ways, in some ways that you can't even like interpret in real time. But that's just like an example of how you could like plan, like using these terms, and that they're not like so defined in the moment, and they're layered. Like
you're
something
talking about bounce and distance as terminology that script writers use. Is that
we
you use it?
We came up with, we coined the terms.
People would talk about it in a similar way, but not as explicit. Like sure, like you could like people would say, oh, you could disguise what happens for a twist, but like we're talking about it with theme in mind. So we're referencing distance as the true possibility of the story in relation to what we're trying to say based on the theme. Whereas people are talking about a twist as a purely entertaining element.
They're talking about twists within only the story dimension. They don't have the thematic dimension in mind at all. To them, that's like an implicit dimension that they're explicitly unaware of. I just wanted to point out, like Alex talked about sequence. Like we don't look at, like, storytellers will say that's the inciting incident point. That's not how we look at things. Heidegger, basically, because of how we have this thematic dimension in mind so much, things are in terms of sequences. And like there is actually no singular point of a thing. That the sequences have liminalities, liminal sequences that basically sorry.
Coincidences. There's overlap
Right.
every single beat in a certain way.
Well, so when you think about these things, are you thinking about how they could be described or explained by older stories that you think were written?
Absolutely. Can I give you an example so you don't think we're crazy? So like, have you seen the movie School of Rock?
Yes.
Great.
I
So
can't say I remember it entirely, but I have seen it.
don't worry. I can bring you back. So like,
It's one of my daughter's favorite movies, so we've probably seen it 2 or 3
one of
times.
my favorite movies too. And like, you know, like we're fucking like kind of like heady. Like, you know, I'm learning a lot of philosophy from Andrew. It's not a heady movie. It's still like my favorite movie. There's a reason that it's like, you know, it's still based on some shit that, sorry, excuse me, but it's still based on some stuff that like it really means something. And to me, that movie is about like what he views being a good rocker means. What does it mean to be a good rocker? So I'm going to take you through a little bit how we would think about uh, the theme in relation to the story. So what happens in the story, in layman's terms? Basically, he's a sad sack, wannabe rocker at the beginning that can't pay his rent. And what happens? He in the exposition of the story, he is let go from his band. He gets fired from his band, and he gets replaced. And he's all pissed off, and he's salty, and actually like a little bit like vindictive. I mean, he feels some type of way towards the band that because it was his band. And anyway,
He's pissed off. Yeah.
So he gets this opportunity at a school, and because of what he learns going through that opportunity, he learns that like being a rocker isn't what he thought it was, and that he wants to give back to the rocking community. How we would look at that in terms of theme is that this is a story, a comedy, and what we mean by comedy. So we extrapolate Aristotle's from the Poetics, which is a very famous like. And Andrew says that he's the father of story, and Aaron Sorkin references in his masterclass, but no offense to Aaron Sorkin, I don't think he fully grasped what he's talking about.
You can't know what he's talking about unless you read other Aristotle works. Like, in my opinion, if you do not have a grasp of his metaphysics or physics, you cannot actually understand the Poetics.
And I wouldn't know this unless Andrew honestly explained this to me. But I brought Poetics up, and that kind of like spurred like what we're talking about, and we started talking about individual sequences of stories. Anyway, so Aristotle talks about comedy as a character, the protagonist that starts in a tragic state and they end in a glorious one or something like that, and they come in the climax and they come from the lowest point and they end up on top. But what we talk about, and I think you read it, is like, well, what is that like success in relation to? Like in today's conception of story, that's in relation to entertainment. Well, what does that mean? Everybody has a different concept of what success is in terms of entertainment. What I think is successful. I might think that like abortion is bad, but other people would think it was good, or vice versa. I don't necessarily, but anyway, for the sake of School of Rock, we're talking about a comedy in terms of it agreeing with the theme by the end of the story. And a tragedy would be disagreeing with the theme. So what we would call School of Rock is a theme that goes something like, don't let your ego affect your ethics. So what he's doing at the beginning of the story is he's on the ego side of the theme. And it's not quite the right way to say it, that he's on a side of the theme, but basically
he's agreeing more. So we talk about in terms of agreeing and disagreeing. The function of Jack Black is and the world in which he's situated in is in more of an agreement with
at the beginning, sorry, I want to clarify.
Yeah.
At the beginning, he's disagreeing.
Sorry, yes, disagreeing.
I got you. So like what we would talk about, and like storytellers would tell you this too, that don't talk about theme in such an explicit way, but like at the beginning of the story, there has to be like a little breadcrumb for what's going to happen. And what we're like, but I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to articulate what that breadcrumb means. basically what it should mean is that there's a possibility of him agreeing with the theme, and we show that he wants that in a certain way, but he just doesn't act on it. So at the beginning, he has an opportunity to do what's good for rock in a certain way, but doesn't. And what he thinks is, what I think is good for rock, not what's good for rock ethically, like as a worldview. What's good for rock, I think I'm a good rocker, and that's what matters. So what he does in the inciting incident, and we use differential logic to explain how a character changes, and Andrew can talk about that more explicitly. But basically, the inciting incident is the first time that the protagonist is active on achieving what the eventual theme is. So in the inciting incident, he gets the opportunity to do something not for himself in a certain way. It's disguised, yes, but he gives himself away for the sake of his roommates, for the sake of him being able to pay rent, basically. And that's like a selfless thing, because he used to mooch off his roommate and stuff, and this is all part of the story. So he decides, I'm gonna, and it's, it's not quite clear in the inciting incident, but basically it's like, I'm gonna do what the world thinks is good for the first time, but I'm not committed to it yet. So he's still under this interpretation of like this ego side of the theme. The second act of the story, in between the inciting incident and the climax of the story, he learns what is wrong. And because it's a comedy, he learns, coming from a bad place and thematically, he learns what is wrong with looking at the world from an ego mindset under the guise, the meta structure in a certain way of being a good rocker. And he gets to the climax, and he has the decision, oh, can I take the glory, or should I do what's best for rock and retire from rock? And what does he do? Just like the inciting incident, which Aristotle would call a recognition. And because it's the climax, it would actually be called a reversal, which gives knowledge to this change. He decides to go on the ethics side of the theme for the second time actively. And in that sense, there's this progression. And we show that in the resolution of the story that he's now agreed with the theme, and it's better because of it.
Well, see, I mean, you can tell that same story about a marriage. You can tell that same story about a relationship.
The difference is that each idea has inherently like this meta structure that is just like
you can't, no one would think rock being a rock star, a rocker would be considered a meta structure. Like there's these, like being a rock star, there's a beginning and an end to being a rock star. So like most identities can be considered meta structures in general.
Being a good rocker is
also because if it's an identity that's going to make a good story, it seems to me that it's an identity that is in some sense an ideal. Well, not an ideal, is in some sense a reality that exists in the world.
Big B. It has to be a big B, more or less.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
It's so like
it has to be something that aligns with the big B.
Right. The big
standard of like it being in the world.
Yeah.
Right. So like tie back with Dasein, like we are in Dasein. Dasein is being there, it's existence itself. So the story is in the theme, just like we are in Dasein. So in the sense that the story is constantly relating itself to itself because there's this theme that it knows that it arises from. So that relation to itself, a lot of like Descartes, that relation to itself got interpreted to the subject relating to the object, and in that sense, it divides the actual relation to itself and doesn't actually encompass the full relation to itself. So like with like AI, it's missing that being in the world element. And the reason why it's missing that being in the world element is because all these people that are coming up with the code, they're using a dictionary, an encyclopedia that's dwelling in, that's situated in this Cartesian cogito ergo sum thinking. And that just talking about, oh, we're in this situation. I mean, we're situated in this Cartesian thinking isn't good enough. We literally need another language for our exact language that we have now to reference to in order to actually get the wholeness, the whole picture of experience. And then at that point, you can actually, and this is me theorizing, but like at that point, you can actually have artificial intelligence that actually self-reference itself, because it sees it as in the world. It sees it as being in the world. In essence, we're creating characters, like real life characters that have to make actual decisions with risks. And that the only difference is that the risk is less than the human, because they're able to take in more information than the human. That to me is the upshot of like with AI. And then like with xenobots, like
I talk about Xenobots specifically as an example.
yeah.
So, well, maybe you wanna
No, do your thing.
So, well, I basically heard a little secondhand, but how Xenobots can be programmed in a certain way.
Please correct us if we're wrong about, like, if you have information, because I've only read, I've watched Michael Levin's videos with you and certain other videos. I actually read his paper on the computational self. That took me a little while because there's so many words I didn't know, but amazing. It actually fits with Heidegger perfectly in my mind. But sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. So like I heard about the Xenobots in relation to growing a frog leg, but like let's talk about like
and the eye thing.
And the eye thing, that's so cool. That's amazing. But let's talk about like, okay, well, what if we wanted it to like eat up cancer cells or something like that? Well, the way that we would think about it is like program this like B part of the AB
real quick before you jump in. It's not necessarily eat up the cancer cells. It's that it will know so it retreats from its cluster, and then it starts atomizing itself, and that's how it becomes cancer. In this case, it like will, like how Michael Levin talks about it, but just when we think about it with Theme, it will know to constantly oscillate between atomizing and retreating back to the cancer, and then going back. And there's this constant like learning process where, because it's in this journey.
So I might have an imperfect understanding myself, but in my mind, the Xenobot is a separate issue from his work on cancer cells. So his work on cancer cells is that the cancer separates itself from the community of cells for whatever reason. And one of the things that he's working on is finding the correct electrical signal or the correct junction gap junction that can send a signal to that cell to go back and rejoin the community, which would effectively end the cancer. So that's one line of his work. Another line of his work is Xenobots, is where he removes skin cells from frogs and puts them in a medium. And those skin cells that have been physically removed by him and put into this medium will actually cluster together and form a new creature. It has the same DNA as a frog, but it's not a frog. It's just a little round ball that has motility because it reutilizes the cilia that are on the skin cells that provide motion on the skin cells. It uses those to move itself through the water.
That sounds like the metastructure.
And they can be trained to do certain things. But I mean, they're still working on that thing. So that is a case where the cells are removed and then find a new life. But the cancer cells are where the cancer cell itself removes itself from the community and starts proliferating. And of course, Michael Levin is like anybody else. He uses human language to describe what these things are doing because there's no other way to do it. So with the skin cells that are clustering into these little xenobots, he says, see, they no longer are being forced to be a skin cell. They can go off now and do their own thing and have their own life the way they want. Which, I mean, I find that a perplexing perspective because in my mind, in my story mind, maybe being a skin cell is what that cell was born to do, and therefore there's a purpose and a meaning in being a skin cell, where there's almost no purpose and meaning in going off and building this little bot that can move around and actually be controlled by other people. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, and I can see how it all relates to story, because all these things scale all the way down, right?
Yeah,
Right. And
I didn't. When I was saying cancer, I actually didn't know that Michael Levin did specific research with cancer.
Yeah.
The way that you're talking about that, I mean, that's amazing. Sorry, Andrew, I cut you off though.
I want you to finish what you were saying. I was just going to say the common thing that you were saying, Karen, is that the frog cells, when they're scraped off and they're put into their environment, they form a community. The community and communication is the common factor in both scenarios.
Yes.
And that is the part that people aren't able to actually express very well. Like, that's the job of the storyteller. It's like, what exactly is it? Like, to me, a story, what a story does, the byproduct is communes. It's community building, where different people with different themas can come together and coexist in the same shared space. So
yes, absolutely.
And it also affords them to leave that space and return to that space, because I think that's part of it. It's the forgetting that you're dwelling in the space to then, because you forget, you leave the space only to then remember how to return to it. And then
and I think you've hit on exactly why it's so important that we have good story, because if we don't have good story that everyone can participate in, then we lose our whole sense of community. I mean, it used to be in the old days that a nation had what, language, culture, and can't remember what the third one is, in common. So a nation of people could draw together and accomplish things together because they had a common purpose and a common language.
Right, a ground. They had a ground, right? A shared ground.
But we've lost that completely because we don't have so much a common language anymore. We certainly don't have a common culture anymore. So what is it that's going to draw us together as a people? We have to have good stories that kind of show us how the world works and how we work in the world. And but it has to be done without creating all these propagandistic thou shalt do this or thou shalt not do that kind of thing. A lot of what our modern culture, so much of what I see in Hollywood nowadays is just propaganda for one particular political perspective. And it's such a, it gets so boring. It just gets so boring. It's like, oh yeah, I know what's happening. The guy in the suit is always the bad guy. You know,
they conflate the experience with the trauma or message. Everyone has their own relation to that trauma. The trauma itself isn't the experience. So they're like, they'll write a story and it's like, I want to write about like an affair. We're just going to stick with the marriage theme here. I want to write about an affair. Well, everyone's affair is different. Like everyone, like if there's going to be an affair, the affair itself has to operate under the guise of the definition, the idea of an affair. But how one actually goes about the affair is unique within itself. So you don't think about the story in terms of like they think about it and they don't see the relation. They see it as cut off, where we're just gonna write an affair. And in that sense, you just get the classic cliche affair type scenarios, behaviors, where in reality, everyone has different motivations for why they actually behave in terms of an affair. Like, to go back to what I was saying, Andrew Happy versus Andrew Smiles, like the behaviors versus the motivations, like a behavior can mean an infinite amount of motivations. So in that sense, like the unfolding of the story of the affair needs, if they look at it in terms of an unfolding, and that there's behaviors that relate to an ambiguous motivation in a certain sense, then you will get a uniqueness in the story. And from a tone standpoint, you'll and use the Heideggerian language, you get an uncanniness in the tone where it's not just one tone. It's dynamic in tone because it's so alive. It's reached a point of uniqueness where it's getting to a place where something horrible might actually be funny because it's so in the situation.
Yeah,
Analyze
fair is bad.
Right.
What did you say, Alex?
Who's to say that an affair is bad? Like, sure, like in relation to a good marriage, but what if like you're doing an affair for a noble purpose? Like, people don't think about that people are going to have their own experiences in relation to that. And I think that like a good story will open up that possibility for you to be able to reflect and go back to your own life and think about, okay, well, what does my affair mean in relation to like what's good for somebody else's story, whatever they're going through, and respecting them. And I think that if you just tell the classic, an affair is bad, it's going to fall by the wayside. People aren't going to be able to latch onto that and really take something from that.
Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is Jordan Peterson's admonition that every action is not only the action that I'm doing right now, and not only the effect that it's having on me now, but the effect it's having on the people who are closest to me now, and the effect that it's going to have on me a year down the road, or a week down the road, or 5 years down the road, or 20 years down the road, and the effect that it's going to have on all the people around me next year and 5 years down the road. And every little decision that we make ripples in a pond like that, out and out and out. So yeah, you might tell a story that makes a person think, well, maybe it's okay to have an affair because there are reasons, but then you're not thinking about what you are encouraging people to jump into. That, I mean, I know a lot of people who've gone through that, and 5 years down the road, they say, yeah, I felt perfectly justified in having that affair, but it ruined not only my spouse's life, but it has ruined my life because of all that I've lost because of what I walked away from, and all the opportunity that was in that situation that I could have learned from and that I could have grown from. And I think those are the things that stories don't do a very good aspect of telling, is all the opportunity cost that's involved in every decision.
I love that you said opportunity cost, because it's like for like an AI, for example, they're not taking into account that like every situation, like okay, you see a car stopped in front of you in the road, it's different than it's happening today, it's happening a year from now. These are going to be different scenarios, but I think our way of thinking might be able to bring context to a given scenario, just like if you talk about an affair as like under like the guise of like a metastructure type of mentality, everybody will be able to relate to it based on the context that's in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was a model that AI was based off of and be able to react to that model, it would take into the context of their surroundings in a more applicable way than just saying, there's something in front of me and I'm going to stop. There's something in front of me and I'm going to go this way. It's so robotic, so
Rudimentary,
so linear. But
like,
yeah,
I just want to jump in.
That was a good like time to talk about how it does relate. We're not sure exactly how the execution. We're not coders, but
Right. We just are aware that there's this story structure and there's this thematic structure, and that nobody's talking about this thematic structure, it seems like, in any domain, and that's like the missing link to it all. And just that the requirements for that thematic structure is a certain type of language. And like the upshot is just like having these coders understand the language. That way they can then make a model. And we're not saying get rid of the current AI model. What we're saying is, for the current AI model to be acting in accordance with this thematic model, it's like we have the story structure that just recognizes that it arises out of this thematic structure. and
Yeah,
that
you're saying Michael Levin has a hard time articulating what he's doing in terms of language. I think we could help with that. We could help with coming up with some sort of articulation in relation to like what's tangible in this
Well,
metaphorical
so
way.
we probably have to go now because we've been at this for an hour and a half, but
Sure.
we could do this again. And then the thing that I think is really interesting that you just said, Andrew, is that the thematic structure and how it relates to the story structure is the missing piece, and that comes down to language. And so I wanted to ask both of you: have you read any Andrew Barfield or Owen Barfield?
no, I've heard of him though.
So
Owen Barfield, right?
This book right here is a wonderful book, but it's very difficult to understand. It's called Saving the Appearances. But and I'm trying to find the other one that I have up here. I have another of his books. Oh, here it is. All this stuff here. It's called Speaker's Meaning. And this one is very, you can see it's very thin. So it doesn't require a big time commitment to read it, but I think this is a super important book. And he makes a distinction between the meaning of a word and the speaker's meaning of the word. And he goes back into the evolution of thought and the evolution of language over time, and how in the words themselves you can find the history not only of the person, but the history of the culture and basically the history of the universe, buried in the language. But basically, one of the things he breaks it down into is this diode or dichotomy of accuracy and expression. And I think that's such a beautiful way to explain just the way the world breaks down. If you put all your focus on accuracy, you lose the expression. If you put all your focus on expression, you lose the accuracy. So there has to be some sort of sliding scale between accuracy and expression to get across the true meaning, the communication. And I kind of think that there's a little connection there between when you're talking about the thematic structure and the story structure, because the story structure could be seen as the accuracy, like painting a representational picture that gets all the details right, but you've missed the communication completely, because now that picture just says the same thing that a photograph would say. But when you are really expressive in your artwork, you're communicating heart to heart with people, but maybe they can't understand what the subject was of your attempt to communicate the idea. So you have to find a balance between accuracy and expression. And so I think it would be fun if you guys get a chance to read this book, that come back and we could talk about it in terms of this whole delineation between thematic structure and story structure, if you'd be interested in that.
Definitely interested. That reminds me of this book. It's called Thinking and Being by Irad Kimke. It's
How
a
do you spell the name?
IRAD, Irad, and then Kim. Sorry, it's Kim Hai. It's KIMHI. It is a very difficult book. It is, I would say, it's the epitome of analytical philosophy meeting continental philosophy.
Wow. I never made my way through that. Continental philosophy is a little bit beyond my, it's just, it's outside my wheelhouse altogether, but.
Yeah, I would say I love continental philosophy, but yeah, we're definitely down for that. I was just going to say the story domain is experience. It's the experiential realm. And then just the thematic domain is the beyond the experience. It's Heidegger would talk about a clearing, and it's the clearing itself. It's the clearing that provides the affordance for the subject and object to afford each other. It's it's looking at a story. So I'll just say there's the story dimension protagonist, where it's like you got the main character. But if you look at a story in terms of the theme, the protagonist, if you will, is the collective, is the protagonist and the world that the protagonist is in co-affording each other. So what we have a term for that. It's called the causer, and like what the causer means is kind of like what I just said. It's that which causes the actual story, but the causer itself is tangible in the story, and like that's what is.
So would it relate to the context?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's upholding the contextual threshold in a certain sense. Alex, do you have anything you want to say about the causer?
Well, and like that's the causer. Like if you were related to the story example that we gave, it's kind of like that breadcrumb that's like ever present, and it's metaphoric of the theme basically in the story realm. And we talk about how like in the inciting incident of a story, it's the first time that the causer is like activated, and you're able to see it. And
the causer is active. It's not dormant anymore in a certain sense. So like if the bomb example with the AI, that incites the AI to then activate. It's like not activate, but the causer that's programmed within the AI becomes more active at that point because there's a external force impeding its telos.
Well, I can see we're deep in the weeds of our next conversation already. and we really do need to end this now. So
Sorry.
I like that phrase, the external force impeding its telos. Almost makes me think of the difference between physics and biology.
Yep.
literally,
we have a whole thing. We have a whole thing which we haven't like sent that part of like physics biology in terms of story. My other paper that I sent you earlier, that's like much longer. It addresses all of that in its own language. But yeah,
I mean that one was really so deep in the weeds of analytic philosophy that I had a hard time finding points that would
that's why we're
out.
writing this book for a more like a less trained, like I'm not trained in philosophy at all. That's why I think it's important for like the layman storyteller to be able to like enact on this, so we can actually penetrate the industry. Because if it's too heady, it's not gonna root itself like actually in the world. But
Yeah.
hopefully this can set up like what we could see as like a proof of concept for it actually getting into other industries as well. So
Yeah. For me in this conversation, the thing that was most helpful was taking a story and breaking it down and showing me how the parts fit in that story, in a story that is a good story. And I totally agree with you that one of the weaknesses with today's storytelling is that the movie makers have so many tools available to them that earlier movie makers didn't have, with the big screen and the 4K and the CGI and just all the beautiful special effects and all of that kind of stuff, that story is no longer even important. I mean, one of the movies that I saw last year that I thought was such a waste of time was The Eternals. Beautiful visually,
terrible.
Absolutely beautiful visually. Absolutely no meaning, no story, nothing that you could take away from it. What was that even about? And but then you go back to some of the old classics made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, where they didn't have any of that, and that story lives with you forever. One of the ones that my husband and I watched quite often early in our marriage is I think it was 1937 Academy Award winner, How Green Was My Valley. Very simple story about these coal miners and the hard life that they lived, and yet such a deeply meaningful movie. Yeah. So I think that when people didn't have all those crutches to rest on, then they had to come up with it's the whole idea of constraint forcing creativity. The more constrained you are, the fewer tools you have, the fewer opportunities you have, the more creative work is going to come out of that. So
Absolutely.
So I applaud what you guys are working on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank
And
you for having us.
yeah, I hope we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you guys.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.